Welcome to the Humans of Hospitality podcast with me, Mark Cribb. So, finally we have the nod. 4th of July it is. Boris has pressed the go button and across the country, operators and customers are excited to get started. It won't be easy, we're not out of the woods yet and millions of jobs are still at risk, but whatever the outcome, clearly the first thing we have to do is open the doors again, learn together and assess the correct level of both supply and demand. And I say all this, actually, somebody reminded me this week that I do need to remember that Scotland and Wales are on a different time trajectory. So in England, we're going first, and I'm sure you will be watching, and I will try and do better and remember where people are listening. Okay, so the media and the public, though, they seem to be behind us. We all want hospitality back in our lives, and we all recognise more than ever the importance of time with friends, with loved ones, or with colleagues, and hopefully we'll be more grateful than we've ever been for some time. On this week's podcast, I am chatting to Karl Chessell, who is the Business Unit Director at CGA, the Data and Insight Company. Now, I saw Karl talk at the Hotel and Restaurant Show back in March, pre-COVID, and was really impressed by some of the insights and data that Karl and his team had collated. It was nice to see so many of the thoughts and impressions that I had of the sector backed up by some scientific data and commentary. So I asked Karl at the time if he'd be happy to be a guest on the podcast at a future date, and as we approached the end of lockdown as we knew it, it seemed like the perfect time to put some data behind the theory of what reopening may look like. We actually go on a bit of a journey in this conversation, and it is worth noting that it was recorded about a week before Boris confirmed the 4th of July opening date, which we refer to a couple of times in our chat. And we start with some analysis of what was going on in hospitality pre-COVID. As a result of coming out of a period of political stalemate and uncertainty with regards to Brexit and a decisive election result, executive confidence levels in hospitality were the highest they had been for many years. Ironically, 77% of the sector were concerned about labour shortages, not the potential layoff of 2 million colleagues. We then touch on some of the data around consumer behaviour during lockdown and move on to what Karl and his team have seen in both the USA, China and other countries who are starting to reopen their doors. And then it's post-COVID, and are there any clues as to what we can expect and what we should be focusing on as a sector? I personally was pleased that the consumer does not seem to be wanting a sterile operating theatre with everyone behind screens and masks. Personally, for me, that is not hospitality. Eye contact and big smiles are what are required to help people feel relaxed. As always, for me, it's about doing all the work with the systems and the processes back of house so that customers are and feel safe, whilst front of house everything looks seamless and relaxed, and we create environments where the customer can switch off for a while and spend some time with friends and loved ones. Karl gives out some advice on what he thinks operators should focus on, and we agreed to touch base again in a few months and see what we've all learned. To all of you listening, busy preparing to open your doors, best of luck. And to all of you listening, looking forward to visiting your favourite bar or restaurant or hospitality venue, please do us a favour and try and book ahead. Please be patient when you visit, and please don't simply take pictures of any errors and plaster them all over social media. Please work with us as a sector, and we'll all learn, improve, and look after each other together. And remember, please do me a favour. In return for this free, unsponsored podcast, just pick up the device you're listening on now, scroll down to the review button and hit 5 stars. It'll take just a few seconds, but it really helps me out by getting these conversations heard by more humans. Thank you, stay safe, and enjoy the chat. Karl Chessell, Business Unit Director at CGA, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast this morning. Hugely appreciated. Can you just tell me where in the world are you, Karl?
Yeah, well, geographically, I'm in Stockport, so in my loft in Stockport. Weather looking a little bit miserable, it's fair to say. But
yeah, the heat wave has finished. So you've got an office in the loft, or is this just you're sat next to your router? I appreciate we're doing this remotely. But...
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's an office. We've adapted, as a lot of people have had to adapt through this. So it's a general storage stroke loft room. stroke office, stroke sewing room my wife uses. So it's multifunctional, but it does
Amazing.
the job.
Have you got kids, Carl?
I've got two young children, yeah. So
So it's the
7-year-old.
perfect place to hide.
It is, yeah, yeah. Going through homeschooling
Yeah,
at the moment is an interesting challenge that I think a
yeah,
lot of people.
definitely. Yeah, how you getting on? Have you nailed the maths or?
Um, well, the youngest is 4, so I'm
Okay,
okay on
you're in
his
with a
maths.
chance. Yeah,
So yeah, I'm doing okay on the maths. I think. Luckily, they're relatively young,
excellent.
but it's just that they're missing out on the social side of things. And our
Yeah,
youngest is going back next week, all being well. So yeah, hopefully some sort of
that's
normality for him.
Yeah, that's good. My son is in the first year of secondary school and bought me something the other day about a mast that had fallen over. It was fundamentally working out triangles and Pythagoras and various bits, and it blew my mind. So luckily, I
Yeah.
dived onto a very urgent call, so I didn't look stupid. Can you just explain? I suppose what is CGA? What do you do? And what is a business unit director, please, Carl?
Yeah, good question. So, as a business at CGA, we're a data insight company, and we focus solely on hospitality. So, we live and breathe and love the hospitality sector. And in essence, there's lots of different things that we do, but it's all based around data. So, it's not just our opinion on stuff, it's what consumers are telling us, what business leaders are telling us, what we can measure in the sector. So, we track things like openings and closings. We track the performance of the sector. So many people will be familiar with things like a Coffee Beach Business Tracker, which looks at the managed performance of the out-of-home sector. So sort of 60 operators representing around 13 billion of annual turnover. But essentially, it's all around hospitality. In terms of what I do specifically as a business unit director, I and my team are focused solely on the operator space, also food suppliers to an extent, but it's mainly working with operators on a day-to-day basis. So the large pubcos, casual dining chains, some of the late night sector as well. But essentially, it's all about hospitality.
Amazing. And I saw you chatting at a show in London, which I think was just before the lockdown, February or March time. It was the hotel and restaurant show, and you blew my mind with a phenomenal presentation and heaps of data. And like you just said, really, it was sort of going from thinking to knowing. It was quite good to see the amount of data that was out there that sort of backed up general thoughts and consensus. So who pays for you to collate all this exceptionally useful data?
Well, I guess ultimately our clients. I mean, we collate the data ourselves, and obviously our commercial model is to work with both operators and suppliers for them to sort of buy into that insight. Some of the things they take in house themselves. So we have a file of all licensed outlets in GB, and suppliers, for example, want to know lots of information about those outlets to decide where to focus their sales activities. So they'll take files like that in house, and we also do a lot of consultancy with clients as well, whether it be strategy pieces, or whether it be whereabouts to open, what they do with particular brands moving forward, how they evolve those brands. So there's actually a whole range of different pieces of analysis we do. But ultimately, our client base is major suppliers and also key operators in the sector. We work in GB, but we also have a team out in the US and in France and do international work as well. So we increasingly have a global footprint in this hospitality space.
Amazing. Okay. So some of this stuff that you acquire, I guess if you're looking at bespoke data and analysis, some of it you basically put out for free and you share it and you do webinars, and some of it is sort of behind a paywall where it's bespoke for businesses. Is that fair?
That's fair, yeah. So the conference you saw me was mainly about us obviously sharing some of that insight. We also work with people like UK Hospitality, BBPA, and try to support the sector with insights along those lines as well. But essentially, yeah, we have events, we do webinars. We're passionate about the sector, so we like talking about it. But there's a point then at which, obviously, if people want additional services, they come to us. So Coffee Peach, for example, is a free service for operators. They get to share their weekly sales performance, and we build an industry view so they can benchmark their own performance in the context of that. But there's other things if people want to do more detailed analysis with their EPOS data compared to competitor sets. If they want to look at how they're pricing in Manchester versus other operators, then that's where typically we'll work on a more ad hoc consultative basis, and there will be some charges. So yeah,
Right. Okay. And it's a business that's been operating for quite some time, I think, isn't it?
it is. Yeah, so over 25 years. So it started just tracking, I say just, quite a complex role of understanding where all the licensed outlets were, which ones were opening, which ones were closing, and lots of information about them. So whether they've got a beer garden in the current environment, whether they're doing delivery, what's the quality of those outlets, things like that. So that's where the business started. But then, as I say, focused solely on hospitality and moved into other areas such as the sales data I talked about, such as building a model of on-trade performance so that suppliers can understand how their products are doing versus the rest of the category. So a whole range of services, but as I said really at the start, all about data and insight. That's what drives us along with that passion for hospitality.
Yeah, amazing. Well, like I say, I love being able to go from thinking to knowing. Any particular, thinking of your career, I suppose, any particularly memorable pieces of data or surprises that have come out? Because I guess most of these things are sort of incremental changes, but have you ever been shocked and gone, my goodness, I never knew that?
Yes, I think is the short answer. I mean, we're in a fundamental shift at the moment, so that's interesting because generally things are smaller step changes, but there's always things that surprise you. I mean, when we ask consumers all the time about lots and lots of different things, and we ask business leaders. And as you say, we turn from, I suppose, our own hypothesis and what those things might be to what people actually say. And almost on a daily basis, there are things that you think I didn't quite expect that to come through. But often, when you think about it, when you dig deeper into the data, there is a kind of logic behind it. But I guess that's why we use data to drive what we talk about. It's not just my opinion or somebody else within CGA who has an opinion. It's very much the data that we let and try to let tell the story, really.
Well, that seems to be the world we're in at the moment, isn't it? Scientists and data, controlling things, or at least trying to control things,
Yeah,
and the fine seesaw.
yeah, I think
Okay, so
you're right.
yeah,
And
go on.
sorry, just on that point, I think we've always been recognised the fact that, particularly in hospitality, the skill of the operators as well. So I think that data can really help inform, but it's very much, we see it as sitting alongside and helping operators make informed decisions. It's very much a kind of harmonious relationship we see.
Okay, perfect. So when I saw you chat, it was obviously, like I say, pre-lockdown. You were very much looking at the state of the industry, what had happened over the last couple of years, but I guess some forecasts of where we were going. And I want to touch on that, I guess, because I think it's relevant in sort of, post-pandemic, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's sort of slightly related to what was happening beforehand. And, your data was showing that restaurants really had been on a roller coaster, albeit there was a change in confidence. So can you just chat a little bit around what you'd observed in the early parts of this year?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you say, it seems a long time ago now, doesn't it?
Yeah, it
Almost
does.
a different lifetime. But yeah, in essence, in terms of the key trends we were seeing at that point, we tracked for a long time sort of eating and drinking out frequency through our consumer research. That was remarkably stable. So even though there were pressures in other parts of the economy, you looked at the BRC results over Christmas from the retail consortium, and it was the toughest Christmas in a generation. You look at new car sales, they were challenged, but actually people continued to eat and drink out. And I think really valued the experiences they get in the sector. So, sort of having those great experiences they get out of home were prioritized over just buying stuff. So, that was the kind of positive, really. The demand was there. On the supply side, as you've touched on, there were a number of changes. So, we sort of reached peak restaurants. And obviously, there'd been this huge, to put it in context, this huge growth, particularly in the casual dining sector over a number of years. So that was always going to reach a peak. We obviously saw, sadly, some casualties in that space and some CVAs. But actually, the biggest shift was amongst independents. So the managed restaurant numbers held up. We're still seeing growth at the sort of premium end of that. So people like Dishoom, Ivy Collection, were continuing to open sites. But the shape of the market was undoubtedly changing. We'd seen in the pub sector a sort of sustained decline in the number of pubs, and they were particularly drink-focused pubs, a lot of leased and tenanted, either from operators switching tenure, or equally these were some of the ones that were sort of closing their doors for good. So we'd seen a lot of trends like that. On the consumer side, things like health were seen as important. Sustainability became a real core driver for consumers. Premiumization is something we talk about a lot, and we saw it a lot in drink. So whether that be people switching from sort of standard lager into premium or world or craft. Trying to think of other things off the top of my head. On the go was a key driver. So sort of QSR, coffee, that kind of convenience, being sort of time precious as consumers. That was sort of driving growth in that area. and also the sort of premium element of that as well. So the sort of premium QSR, fast casual brands that were emerging from there. So it was I wouldn't say it was an easy sector to operate in. And I know you operate in the sector, so you'd probably have a view on that. But I think there were people that were doing really well in the sector. The demand was there. As I say, there was shifting supply. The shape of the market was changing, and there were closures in parts of the market. But ultimately, there was opportunity for people to succeed, and confidence was the question you also touched on. Optimism in the sector was actually reasonably buoyant. It took a huge dip after the EU referendum, but it sort of climbed back to a stage where we had around sort of 60% of operators through our business leader research were sort of positive about the market as a whole. And actually, 83% of them were positive about their own business prospects. So, pre the coronavirus pandemic, there was actually a reasonable amount of optimism in the sector.
Yeah, there seemed to be a bounce, I think, didn't there? It was the highest it had been for 4 years. And I guess that was post sort of Brexit clarity and post-election clarity. I think we were all excited thinking, okay, at least, whatever our opinions were on Brexit and politics, at least we were, we didn't have a hung parliament anymore. And we were excited to have 5 years of stable government and a definite direction in Brexit. So it did feel that around February time, probably, and your data reflected it, that, it was the most positive sentiment for quite some time, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you've hit the nail on the head from our perspective in terms of the drivers there. I think it's very much that clarity. And as you say, whichever side of the political spectrum, the people wanted some clarity, and whether they wanted to, most of the leaders actually didn't want to leave the EU, but at least we had a path that people could work towards and a time frame. So yeah, optimism was reasonably good. And it's funny, we did a webinar just near St. Paul's to sort of share the results with some of the business leaders that completed the research. And it was just at the time when the outbreak had obviously happened in China, and we were starting to see some of the outbreaks in Italy as well. But I don't think any of us could have predicted quite the impact that was going to have at that point.
No. And there was a certain irony that one of the things that was a concern at that time, I saw that 77% of people were concerned about labour shortages in the market, whereas now we seem to have swung to being concerned about 2 million people being laid off. Had that labour situation been getting worse for a period of time?
It had, yeah. I mean, there were concerns. I mean, there's a lot of people, both operators and also, Kate at UKH, push hard on building careers in hospitality. As a sector, that's sometimes been a challenge, and there were particular staff shortages at sort of back of house, sort of finding skilled workers. And that was sort of touched on some of the immigration policy around that time of what the points-based system was going to be, and was it going to value hospitality skills? And the reality was it didn't look like it was going to. But so there was concern at that point around absolutely the availability of staff post Britain leaving the EU, and also about how those skilled staff could be brought into the sector and retained. You're right. Now, fundamentally, there's a huge concern over what the shape of the market's going to be post-lockdown, what that's going to mean for unemployment in the sector. There is still a concern actually amongst operators about retaining good quality staff. So nearly half of them in our recent survey said they were concerned about keeping good staff. Obviously, with what's happened and a lot of people on furlough, some of those people may look to other sectors within the current landscape. So that is a concern, because people have invested in these people. They have good quality people, and they've spent, I know we've talked to operators, they spent a lot of time really engaging with those staff during this period. And it's also one of the things that I think people are going to focus on in the reopen, is that sort of cultural side of things. We won't have the lever of big wage increases when we open the doors again and people can return to the workplace, but sort of engaging around culture, values, and making them enjoyable places to work, I think, is where people are going to focus. So, but you're right, we have sort of pivoted from that. Are we going to be able to get enough people to how many jobs can we save? It's a really tough time, to state the obvious, for the sector.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll come back to some of the things that are happening, sort of employment-wise, post-COVID shortly. But one of the things you did predict, which you must pat yourself on the back for even more now, is you did say that delivery was sort of thriving and starting to dominate the market even more, and that seems to have obviously, in the absence of being able, the on-trade deliveries become huge. Did you have any data around, I suppose, the complexity of that? Because most operators seem to have sort of dipped their toe into, Deliveroo and Uber and the likes of those, but they are, quite expensive commissions to be paid, and there's a lot of people debating whether it's actually a viable addition to the business. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd agree. Frankly, I think when we've asked business leaders about it, we asked them a couple of years ago about it, and generally there was a view that people need to do it. But when we talked about the pros and the cons, there was a general overall negative sentiment towards it. I think that did start to shift. So the last survey we did in sort of February around about this topic, we did see that there was a more positive sentiment towards delivery. I think still concern over the costs from third parties, and also the fact that you are literally giving your brand to somebody else to deliver. So I don't think those issues and concerns have been overcome, but I think people had seen the sales growth and had recognised that it was an important channel to embrace and one that couldn't be ignored. So we sort of track. We don't publish it. We do track delivery, and we've seen that grow, as you say. So it's not through any sort of crystal ball gazing that I can pat myself on the back. We've seen that grow. We know amongst certain operators it's a really, really important part. And obviously through what's happened of late with the lockdown, the only channel realistic that people have been able to embrace, we know it's become a priority for certain people. I think some operators initially were going to do a big focus on delivery and then actually decided not to, mainly through concerns about staff safety. But I know that as we focus on the reopen, many of those, particularly large operators, are looking to re-embrace delivery. So it's absolutely here to stay. I think there are still some ongoing challenges, as you say, around the high cost. But consumers have embraced it pre-lockdown. They've embraced it even more during lockdown, and I think it's absolutely here to stay. It's just how you execute it correctly, and obviously how individually or as a sector we can challenge some of those third party costs.
Yeah, I think it's hugely challenging, and I think if you're a good sort of restaurant a la carte style food, and certainly historically, where you'd probably designed your kitchen and your staffing levels around a certain capacity in your restaurants, however many covers you could sit, it was quite hard to add any additional capacity to add delivery, but also it sort of ruins the vibe of the restaurant if there's lots of motorbikes and high vis jackets and
Yeah.
food going out over the pass. I guess if all of a sudden we're only operating at maybe 50% of our covers, then it might be a great model. But it seems to be particularly useful for people who are building it in at the sort of concept stage with a few high margin items and maybe a separate kind of entrance to the kitchen where stuff can go out. But then I guess even more so is these sort of dark kitchens and places purely set up for delivery. Has there been any data around that sort of growth in the market as well?
We've seen it. We don't actually measure it, to be honest. But you're right. People are looking at that. I think there's polarized opinions. I think on the value of the sort of dark kitchen model, in terms of obviously what people have done is spent a lot of time building their existing brands, and ideally would leverage that through their existing um, sites. But we know it's definitely a growing trend. We just don't unfortunately have a data point on it.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. The whole delivery thing. I think I was going to talk about it later, depending on where this conversation go. But the sort of omni-channel, we've seen it in delivery. We've actually seen a growth in drinks delivery. So a lot of people have been either sort of ordering direct from breweries. People like Cloudwater Brewery have been doing deliveries. Shindig up in the northwest. But also operators have been doing drinks delivery, and I think people have been dabbling in that previously. So be it one, we're doing sort of cocktail deliveries, but I think that's something that we may see continue. So people will get a restaurant quality meal delivered with some of the drinks to sort of recreate that out of home experience at home, and that might be one
Yeah.
of the things that we see continuing.
Yeah, it's so challenging because restaurant quality. I know there's a lot of restaurateurs who would argue that if you stick a meal in a box on the back of a motorbike and whiz it around town, it probably doesn't arrive
I
as a
couldn't
restaurant
agree more.
quality meal.
No, I couldn't
Yeah.
agree more. And I think it's interesting that it's not just about delivery. I suppose when you think about omnichannel, it's also we've seen of late people like Wagamama and Nando's offering sort of recipes so people can recreate at home, which again might not be not going to be exactly the same quality you would necessarily get at a restaurant, and certainly doesn't have the ambience that goes with that experience. But also people like Coat, 6 by Nico, have obviously been delivering meals that you can cook yourself at home. So I think, to me as a consumer, it's not the same, but it is interesting that people are obviously missing those experiences they can get out of home and are trying to recreate them in some form at home. So I do think
Yeah,
that will
yeah.
continue to an extent.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's an inevitability, and I think it's really tricky as a restaurateur to get your head around it. I appreciate you sort of represent all sectors of it, but at my level, we've seen it over the last couple of years. Incredibly difficult trading environment, as you say. Demand was there, but probably supply was up, so it was just spreading a fixed demand over more operators. But I think with the likes of Amazon Prime and Netflix and Disney Channel and all of these things that people can have at home, people were automatically thinking, well, we might as well just stay in and watch something decent on the telly. But add to that now the fear around distancing and being in confined spaces. I think it's going to be an interesting space for the winter, but I do think it's hard to operate. And we bought a couple of scooters and a car a couple of years ago and tried to add delivery to one of our businesses and do it ourselves, and it was just really complicated, and the time involved in taking meals across town, I sort of struggle to see, people like delivery who don't make any money, and I can see why, because it's a complicated sector.
It is.
One of the other trends that you spotted, and I kind of, I suppose it's slightly the power of data, but I've been a little bit frustrated in the last 10 days. But if we look around the sort of health and ethics of food, that a bit more on flexitarianism and veganism, which was great, and people caring about the provenance of food, which is all stuff that I love. But then you see the queues outside of McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken in the last 10 days, and people queuing up for 2 hours to buy what is obviously an incredible burger, because I don't want McDonald's to sue me. So how do you deal with the juxtaposition around some of that? Are we basically seeing huge growth in what is still a very small section of the market, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously there are people that have been missing various brands, and obviously McDonald's is part of some people's repertoire, and therefore we have seen queues. We've seen the same in retail, haven't we, with these big queues at IKEA? So I think there's a sense that people do want to return to some sort of normality, and maybe that's what's highlighting that in this instance. I think you're right about that kind of juxtaposition between that and health and ethics, sustainability. We see those as, and as you're aware, I talked about it at the presentation I did at HRC. We see those as really key drivers at the moment. And actually, sort of through the current period, I think those have been magnified, if anything. So there is a divergence. I mean, we've long asked consumers about their healthy lifestyles, and then we look at where they go to, and that doesn't always come through in where they're eating and drinking. But there's a genuine intent, I think, from lots of people to lead a more healthy lifestyle. We have asked during the lockdown what people have been doing with their time, and one of the things has been a focus on health. So obviously there's been a lot of concern about health because it's a global health pandemic, but nearly, I think 39% of consumers have been focusing more on their personal health and exercising more, and are expecting that to continue. So I do think that health as a driver is important, but it's not everyone. And also, we are not healthy all the time. I think the flexitarianism thing you talked about and sustainability, I think, again, these were key drivers. What business leaders are telling us, they're focused on longer term, and also what consumers are telling us. These are absolutely core now, and so I don't think they're going to go away. If anything, sort of the ethics and sustainability, I think, have, again, as I said, been magnified during this period. We've seen lots of brands in the space do a lot of good work, for example, on the ethics side. So, people like Leon with their Feed Britain initiative, Brewdog with the hand sanitizers, examples like that, many, many examples. And I think hospitality's done that very much with genuine intent, not for PR and marketing purposes in the main, because I think there's a lot of good people in the sector, and consumers get that. Actually, we're asking consumers about the sort of brands and they would engage with longer term. And I think 75% of them said that they would go and visit brands that they think have done the right thing through this process. So I agree, there's a kind of odd dichotomy of of health and some QSR brands. But I think generally that health, sustainability, ethics, from what we're seeing in our consumer research, were important pre-lockdown, and I think have only been exaggerated during this period.
Well, I certainly hope that is the case. I guess one of my frustrations is that we launched a drive-through. Only one of my venues has got a car park, and it's only got 6 bays. So we turned it into a little drive-through, and it means you can order and pay online, and you get sent a text with a bay number to pull into at a certain time, and then we pop out and we pop your food straight in the boot. So it was completely contact kind of ordering process, and it's a great quality burger and some chips and a salad for a tenner. And I have not needed to employ any police officers to manage my queue at any point during that process, disappointingly. So it's been a little bit of a frustration. But I do agree that I think the sector has held its head very high. And I think if you work in hospitality, you're right. It's not about PR and marketing. It's fundamentally, hospitality is a reflex. You have this innate desire to make other humans' being sort of lives better. And automatically, if you see someone, you offer them a beer or a cup of tea and you look after them. And I think we've done the same. And I'm hoping that we come out the other side of this pandemic with a little bit more respect, because we've always been known as this sort of stopgap and something that people do in between university and getting a real job and all that kind of stuff. But I think the industry has done a lot of good stuff, and the same as the NHS. I think they've got a lot more respect coming out the other side of it, and I hope that we have as well.
I think that is the case.
Yeah, I've got to ask, how do you decide which way round to present a number? Because, for example, just then you said 39% of people have improved their health and fitness during the lockdown, which to me means that sort of 61% haven't. How do you decide which way round to present that data?
That's a good question. That I think some of it is. I don't actually have the full breakdown of that question, but some of it will be people who haven't changed their behaviour. So there'll be a proportion of people that were already exercising, and obviously a portion of people that perhaps weren't exercising very often, and their behaviour will be unchanged. There'll be a smaller percentage that have exercised less. So therefore, on balance, you would say, and I don't have the stats, but if it's 39% are exercising more, it might be, for argument's sake, 50% are doing it the same, and therefore there's quite a small percentage that are doing it less. So we would focus on, the overall net behaviour. Therefore, would be that, on balance, more people are exercising more than are exercising less. So that's how we would tend to do it. But often there are nuances within the data, and that takes a bit of exploration as well.
Yeah. Okay. I think it was good. The fact that Boris said, you can go out for an hour's day to exercise was great, and it wasn't just you can go out for an hour a day and just get some fresh air. It was specifically go out and exercise. It's good for your mental health. So I hope there's been a change there, and I hope consumers care a little bit more about what they buy. But it's a bit like I used to run health clubs, and when I ran health clubs, you used to have a swimming pool, and people would come in and go, "Have you got a pool? Have you got a pool?" And you'd show them the pool, knowing that nobody ever used the pool. People just don't use it. And it's the same with healthy food. It's like, have you got some really healthy food? Yeah, it's absolutely there. But most people, when they sit down, order a burger and chips. It's always the biggest selling things.
It's funny we talk about that ourselves, actually, because I think not having those healthy options is a turn off. But you're right. A lot of people, when they're in venue, will actually choose the slightly less healthy option or the more indulgent option, because often it is about enjoying yourself. And therefore, I think it depends on what part of the sector you're in. If you're on an everyday, on-the-go sector, people might go for more healthy options more regularly. But if it's an indulgent weekend treat with friends, then you may look on the menu for and think, oh, that's got a great range of healthy options. But we know, as I said, when we look at the sales of the products that are sold, but also what consumers tell us they actually had, it doesn't always carry through. So I said, we have the right intent, but it doesn't always carry through, unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess that's why data is part of a decision-making process, basically, in what you sell, isn't it? And it's also the art, not just the science of hospitality, I suppose.
Absolutely, which is the point I made earlier. It's not, the data can't make all the decisions for you. It's very much an art, and it has to go hand in hand with operator skill. But as I said, on that specific point around health, I think not having any healthy options on your menu would reduce your footfall. But like you say, it might not translate into sales, but it might indirectly, because it gets people into your site to then have the burger and chips.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, we put posts out on social media about a new sort of plant-based offering, and it will probably get the most interaction and the most likes. But in sales terms, it's absolutely negligible. But it certainly shouts about what you do, and I think ethically, it's very important. to show that you've got those options, basically. So, moving away then. So that was the sort of pre-lockdown scene. During lockdown, we'll only touch on this very briefly, but I saw you had some data around sort of people's behaviour, and that was mainly through looking at sort of footfall and traffic. Is that right? I saw some charts basically that showed, and it was different. It sort of London was nowhere near the same level as sort of region. It looked like the regions had dropped to maybe by 90% of normal footfall, but London was more like maybe 70%. Is that fair? And where were you getting that information from?
It's partly fair, I think. So basically, that was something we're working in strategic partnership with Wireless Social. What they do, because they're a Wi-Fi provider, they're still picking up a lot of presence data, so they can do a like-for-like comparison of what footfall was like pre-lockdown, what's happening during lockdown, and obviously it'll be useful to measure that as we come through the other side. So actually, they were seeing in lots of areas sort of drops of footfall of around 80%. The kind of London chart I think you're referring to, what we saw there was sort of in the city itself, sort of footfall was down around 80%. So in the sort of Square Mile and Canary Wharf, it was 80% plus. But actually in the sort of London villages, the sort of reduction in footfall was lower. So it was around 60% down. So there's a sense that definitely people are staying local. Obviously, that's been part of the messaging through this period, through the government, but that's sort of coming through in the data. So we've not obviously got lots of people walking around the high streets at the moment, unless you need to be there because you're a key worker. It'll be interesting to see how that changes once retail starts to open. So I think that's going to be a really interesting one to watch, and that's sort of why we're really happy to be in that sort of partnership with Wireless Social. So yeah, we've seen that on the footfall, and then in terms of other sort of lockdown behaviour, we've sort of captured through consumers. They've obviously been doing a lot of virtual socialising, so people have been using Zoom and a house party app and things like that, using delivery, which we've already touched on. So I think, to me, I've been asked a few times if you see that as a threat. I actually think it's not. I think what we're largely seeing is people are trying to replicate, as we touched on earlier, really some of those experiences they get out of home at home. And I think generally they're a kind of poor substitute. So I think people are looking to return to the sector. We're asking consumers about intent at the moment in GB, and we've got around 22% of people that say they're kind of ready to go back to the sector as soon as they're allowed to. But the vast majority of people are going to do it with caution. They're going to need some reassurance because obviously there are sort of ongoing concerns amongst the general public about the pandemic.
Okay. So just before we move into that sort of, what things are going to look afterwards, I guess one of the things we've been doing is looking at other countries that are ahead of us. I've done a couple of podcasts with operators in Shanghai just to sort of hear about their experience. What other countries are you looking at? Is it just China, or have you got some other data, and what's the data showing that's happening with regard to sort of bouncing back?
It's not just China. We did a specific survey on China because obviously they had a full lockdown, and so we picked up in different regions the sort of reopen and what consumer behaviour is doing. We thought it was interesting to not just ask in GB what consumers say they're going to do, because obviously that can change, but to see what had actually happened. But we've also done research in the US as well. So we have a team really focused on the US out in America, but also in GB that support that team. So that's a big growth area for us. We also do research in other countries as well. But the China stuff was obviously the stuff I shared with you previously. And actually, if you look across what consumers in GB are saying they like to do, what we've seen in China and what we've seen in the US, there's a lot of parallels. So, for example, in China, we conducted some research about a month after the sector reopened, and about half of consumers had returned to the sector. So there wasn't necessarily a rush back. There was a kind of cautious and steady return. It tended to be younger people that came back quickest, and the people that previously went regularly were also the people that returned to the sector quickest. So that sort of loyal core came back fastest. Generally, we're seeing not only sort of footfall and visit levels down, but we are also seeing spend slightly down as well. So in China, the average spend at the moment is around 9% lower than it was pre-COVID. But you're obviously going to continue to track that. So generally, there was a cautious return to the market, I think, is in summary. I think we also saw that people were staying local, to our point earlier. and people are absolutely needing the sort of reassurance about what operators are doing to ensure their safety. So in China, they've got a green light QR code, but it's also about personal distance, and it's also about things like hand sanitizers and hygiene. So consumers are obviously going to need that, as I say, reassurance that the venues they're going to are taking their health seriously. And I think the other element that came out is about communication of that. So doing it is great, but ultimately you need to tell consumers what you're doing. And I think, again, there's some great examples of what operators are sharing their plans. And I think that's really, really important to have that transparency with consumers.
That's quite a scary number that sort of trade was fundamentally 50% down, or people going out 50% down for even 4 weeks after reopening, which sort of affirms, I guess, what a lot of operators are saying in the UK is it's all well and good being told that legally you can open, but financially, does it make sense to open? That's quite a scary number.
It is quite scary. I mean, we're seeing some recovery. It started slow, and in the US, for example, sales are nearly 40% lower than they were. So at the end of May, they're about 39% lower than they were pre-COVID. So you're right, that is quite scary. But when we're asking about sort of consumer intent, I think people will return to the market. It's just going to take time. But you're right, revenues are going to be lower. We know there are substantial financial challenges already because of no revenues other than by delivery potentially. So it's great that we have a reopen to focus on within GB, but obviously it by no means that operators are out of the woods. As you'll well know, it's going to be a kind of slow road, and there's going to be a need for ongoing support from government. Ultimately, it's going to take time, I think, for us to see those frequency levels that we saw pre-lockdown return.
Yeah. So one of the stats that didn't necessarily surprise me, but I thought it was a little bit scary, turning towards sort of reopening, was that 100% of startups under 3 years are very pessimistic about the next 12 months. I was like, wow, that's some data there, isn't it? Very pessimistic, and it's everybody, but particularly in the startup market. Are you seeing some of the established operators? I suppose it's your thoughts on, who's going to come out of this? Is it the established players with, bigger balance sheets where they can maybe leverage some cash? Is it the more nimble sort of independents? What's your thoughts on that?
It's making predictions is always a challenge.
Yeah.
But I think there's a little, so not to sit on the fence too much, I think there's a little bit of both in there. I think I do have concerns about smaller operators who don't necessarily have the same access to funds, the same teams that can make key decisions around pricing strategies, around marketing strategies, etc. So I think operators that can't access those funds, and we know for the reopen, the Leader research told us that people are going to need around 9% of annual turnover to reopen a site. So just being able to open isn't enough. They're going to need funds to do that. So I do worry about people's ability to access those funds. Obviously, the bigger operators can speak to their funds, to their investors. They can refinance. I do have concerns. That said, there's huge innovation in the sector, and I think that nimble, sort of agile behaviour that some of those display and that great entrepreneurialism, I think some of those will have the finger on the pulse with their consumers. We know some of them have pivoted really well into delivery. So some of the independent lease and tenancy pub operators I know are actually doing reasonable amount of sales in that space. So I don't think it's going to be kind of black and white on who, but we've seen over a number of years that decline in the independent sector. So I talked about managed restaurants. Those numbers have held up, even though we've sort of seen sort of peak restaurant numbers. So I do have fears for some of those smaller operators. Obviously, some of the larger operators are going through CVAs and so on, because the other aspect is if you're a pubco with freehold, it's arguably easier than if you've got sort of obviously long-term rent agreements that you need to renegotiate or get out of.
That number that sort of jumped out there for me, that 9% of annual turnover to reopen. So you're saying if you're £1 million turnover business, it's going to cost you £90,000 to open the doors. Is that right? And are you saying they've got to spend that, literally, before they generate any revenue?
I think that's necessarily before, and some of it will relate to sort of cash flow. But that's what came out when we asked business leaders about the funds that they would ultimately need. Wow. So it's quite a substantial number, and some of that will be, as I say, to re-engage with staff that are going to come off furlough. Obviously, the coronavirus job retention scheme has been a bit of a lifeline for many, but you're having to pay those people with reduced revenue numbers. So some of it, I think, is projecting forward. We weren't really explicit in the question about the fine detail of it, so it'll be how people have interpreted to a certain extent. But ultimately, it comes back to that point that just being able to open doesn't mean everything's back to normal. It's going to be an ongoing challenge, sadly, for the sector and for many operators.
And certainly from a support perspective, the biggest thing that I think came out was going to be around rent, or either where support was required, or where the biggest challenge was going to be clearing this sort of backlog of rent demands. I think it was last night that the government came out with this code of conduct, which has been largely, I'm going to say, ridiculed in the press today. Yeah, I think so. I think that's probably the word. Is that fair that rents is one of the biggest challenges that people are talking to you about?
Yeah, absolutely. And it came out loud and clear in the business leader research. As I said, the furlough scheme has been a significant help during this period, and I think many operators wouldn't have survived without that. But this rent challenge continues to be a hot topic. That came out loud and clear in our research. Obviously, there's lots of people focused on different ideas, such as national timeout. A lot of people are more expert on this than me, but we also know a lot of individual negotiations are going on between operators and landlords, and we've seen the CVAs. But I think unless this gets sorted, we're going to have reduced revenues when we open. We know that. That's what our data is clearly telling us. We look at other markets, that's what we can see. So whether that's around turnover-based rent, how we square that circle, I think, is a huge challenge. And I agree. I think the government code of conduct, I think, to me, doesn't go far enough. So I think we know it's a hot topic. We know people like Kate at UK Hospitality, others in the sector like JD are really focused on this, and I think it needs to be, because we're sort of seeing in terms of projections of the size of the market that the market could be sort of 15, 20, 30% smaller out the other side. And it obviously, employing the number of people it does, over 3 million people in the sector, if we don't get some help around that as a sector, I do think those numbers could be worse. So there's a lot of people focused on that are more qualified than me, but I do think it's fundamentally a huge issue that needs addressing.
Yeah, I mean, it feels logically that we just need to go into this sort of temporary period of hibernation, and that we and that's for everybody. That's for the landlords and the tenants and the customers, and everybody pauses, and then everybody's given the chance to come back. The concern at the moment is that once this rent moratorium is over, that the landlords are going to be very aggressive. They're just going to change the locks. They're going to take restaurants that quite possibly people have spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions, on, and take them back. And I guess the motivation for the landlords to do that is because they think it's going to be easy for them to flip that on to another operator and that demand's going to be there. Whereas I think we probably feel in the industry that demand isn't going to be there. And I suppose to our advantage, it isn't going to be a case of simply, lots of operators queuing up to step into these spaces. That would be backed up then. You're not expecting there to be this this huge surge. I mean, you'd like to think that the VCs had their fingers burnt a little bit, in just in the last couple of years, let alone during this period of lockdown. So your expectation is some sort of contraction in the market, is it?
Yeah, absolutely a contraction. I mean, it's just how big, and sadly there will be businesses that don't reopen. And you're right. I think longer term, I'm sure some of these areas will return. We don't know the full impact of the sort of working from home model and what that will do to London numbers and so on. But maybe prime sites will be able to be flipped, but the demand for those sites is definitely going to be lower. It has to be. So, I don't think in that respect, I think to me, landlords would be quite naive if they think they could just flip all those sites, not just in hospitality, but obviously retail is a challenge. So I think for me, it's about those landlords being fair, obviously negotiating with the sector and with individual landlords, but recognising the fact that, they may be better negotiating a rent that's fair for the long term than risk having empty units with no rent.
Yeah, seems like a no-brainer. Another one that shocked me was this: 31% of operators said they would keep some outlets closed permanently. So not even that they weren't going to reopen them on the 4th of July, but a permanent closure. Was that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, and I think obviously we've seen with the CVAs that have been announced. I think we're starting to see evidence of that. as you say, nearly a third are planning to not open certain venues. So talking a bit earlier on about things that surprised me, I think that didn't massively surprise me. As I said, we did talk about predictions about the size of the sector, and that sort of ballpark is 20-30% smaller, which is hugely significant. And
It is,
I
yeah.
think shouldn't be undervalued given the contribution to employment and obviously the treasury that the sector provides.
Massively, yeah. I was chatting to Chris Gumbel from Brewhouse and Kitchen a couple of days ago, who was saying that I think we pay something like £38 billion a year into the treasury and various sort of taxes and stuff like that. And it's such a huge contributor, isn't it? And if you lose a third of that, for the sake of what is probably only what is it, national timeout is 9 months. Whatever support you offer, it's negligible in the scheme of what we actually generate for the economy on an annual basis.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the government, as I say, has stepped in other areas, and I think it just needs to step in again. Is my personal view. It's not necessarily to me, it's just this whole pandemic. Obviously, is is a tragedy for lots and lots of people. But when you look at it on pure economic terms, I think the government's going to have to support to get through this. And I agree from a business rates, from a treasury perspective, it's massive, and it's a massive employer. I think it's also important to the sort of social DNA of our country as well, without being too sort of carried away. I think it's a big part of who we are and the social currency and where we interact as human beings. So I think we shouldn't underplay that. But clearly the economic sort of impact will probably be felt first and hardest.
Yeah, I do hope that there is some more recognition of that. I mean, I've had that frustration. I've got a seafront venue, right on the beachfront, and it's a key reason for lots of people as to why they would, choose to live, locally to this area, is because you can pop down and you can sit on a balcony, you can have a nice dinner and a beer overlooking the ocean, and people come up and they go, it must be great. I presume the council are really supportive of you and that they help you out and look after you because you do such a great job. And you think, oh my goodness, no, it is purely a can you get every penny that you possibly can out of you. And this is again what Chris and I were chatting about with beer duties and wine duties and all of the rates and VAT and all of the things we get hit with. Yeah, I agree. I think we are part of placemaking. We are the reason to be on planet Earth is to spend some time with your family and friends, and whether it's anniversaries or birthdays or business meetings, all of these life events, or meeting your future partner and ending up having kids, and all of these things happen in bars and restaurants and in hospitality. And if there can be a bit more recognition of that and a bit more support, because it feels like there's been a lot of people speaking more publicly about margins of between 3 and 7% and how it's unsustainable for the sector. And I was chatting to Mark Hicks, and he's obviously gone under during this period. And back 20 years ago, you could make a decent living in restaurants, but it does feel like it's as hard as it's ever been, which is disappointing. Yeah, just from a societal perspective, we can improve town centres and high streets and make them vibrant and energised again, but not if we're charged rents and taxes that make it impossible to operate.
I couldn't agree more. I did a presentation actually at our own Peach 2020 conference around that very topic, and the impact on how hospitality can help regenerate certain locations, and particularly the role. I sort of grew up in a seaside town myself, but we've got some huge issues in our coastal communities. I think hospitality can be a real driver in those areas, and it needs to be embraced like that and supported. And you're spot on. I think we know margins were thin even before this. The lockdown. So yeah, there's going to a lot of ongoing support is going to be needed, and I think it's critical. I think it makes financial and economic sense, but yeah, from all the reasons you've outlined and we've agreed on, I think it's that social side of things that shouldn't be underestimated.
Yeah, well, I'll let you know how it goes. I will be locked into rent negotiations with my local council on very soon, and I hope they recognise that. Yeah, it's not just about money, and people who work in hospitality, rarely is that the primary motivation. So sort of looking at reopening then, and we're a few weeks away from, we still haven't been told we can definitely open, but we're working towards this 4th of July date, having had the little teaser of the 22nd of June a few days ago, sort of kicked into the long grass. There's this debate around, it's all well and good being told you can open, but should you? What's your understanding of the consumer? Is there a demand? Do they want to come back? And I guess what's the difference between city centres and more localised rural communities?
Yeah, good question. I mean, yes, by and large, people do want to come back, but as I mentioned earlier, they need that reassurance. So I think it will be cautious. There is different segments of society who are in a slightly different mindset at the moment, and there's sort of a chunk of people, as I say, about 22% that will come back. There's some people that are going to need some reassurance. There's also a portion of people who will come back, but their frequency might be lower. So that's why overall our view is that net sort of footfall and net frequency of visit will be lower. It's about what you can do, obviously, to reassure those people that it is safe, and to see those people re-emerge over time. So I think from our perspective, and from what the data is telling us, we think it will be slow and steady in terms of that footfall returning. I think there's no other way of looking at it. But I guess the good thing is people do want those experiences. As I said, they've been trying to replicate them at home. We think people will come back to the market. People are telling us they want to come back, but obviously, through what everyone's been through, it's understandable that people are going to be cautious. So as I said, it's partly going to be about putting in those necessary operational steps to reassure customers, but also communicating really clearly. And I think over time, those consumers will return. We know operators are, we talked about delivery earlier, but people are also looking at whether they maybe operate with a reduced menu and things like that. So I think the offer might be slightly different as well as obviously the spacing that's going to be needed, whether that be 2 metre or 1 metre, obviously to be confirmed. But you're right. I think most people are excited. Both consumers and operators are excited about having a 4th of July to aim for, and I think for us that's really, really exciting. But it's obviously not going to mean that everything's suddenly okay again. I think but it's nice to have that date to focus on, and we can start getting back to some semblance of normality.
So, you're looking and chatting to probably some of the bigger players in the industry and what they're doing. If you were sat and chatting, to an independent with all of the sort of learning that maybe they can't necessarily access and afford to do the research, what advice would you give to sort of someone with maybe a one site or a few sites with regards to reopening? Any specific nuggets that you could tell them to focus on?
Yeah, I think obviously being aware of the obvious need for personal distance, hygiene, hand sanitizer. They seem obvious, but I think having them visible, telling consumers what you're doing, whether that's as they come in, whether it's on your website, reassuring them that your venue is a safe place to go. I think there's a lot of people have already pivoted into delivery, and we talked a lot about that today, into drinks delivery. I think looking at those sort of omni-channel type experiences. So, can you either deliver your food in fridge form so that it can go straight into the oven? Can you show your recipes? So just to increase that engagement with consumers. I think obviously understanding your own consumers. So I've talked in sort of broad terms about consumers, but if your consumers are younger, if they were regular visitors previously, they may well come back quicker. And just talking to them, you might not be able to sort of conduct wide consumer research, but as they do come back, or through your Facebook sites, your website, try and get a feel for what your consumers are looking for. And I think ultimately, we know it's such an adaptable sector. I think just continuing to offer those great experiences, it might seem slightly, well, it will be slightly different. Of course it will. But I think there's, seeing what Inception Group are doing around their ways of sort of embracing the what they have to go through, I think is really interesting with their kind of beekeeper outfits and so on. I think, just understanding your own customers, recognizing that consumers will be cautious about return, and what reassurance you can give them, I think, is going to be fundamental. But also looking at those different channels, can you drive additional frequency by offering takeout or offering delivery, offering your recipes to just sort of create that ongoing engagement with your customers.
Yeah, I was quite pleased to see in sort of what's the consumer actually looking for, because I know in China, again, chatting to the guys that I interviewed over there, everybody had to be in masks. It was temperature checks as you came in. It was logged, and the perspex screens a bit of, and actually, for me, long-term hospitality person who absolutely loves the sector, and it's all about eye contact and smiles and the thought. I just wouldn't bother going to a restaurant if I couldn't see people's smiles and I couldn't see their eyes and they all stood behind plastic and I had to sit in a sanitized plastic box. I wouldn't bother. I was quite reassured to see that what the consumer was looking for was actually the sensible stuff, which is easy. Put the tables a bit further apart, have sanitizer available, more cleaning and distancing. But they were less concerned about masks and sort of improved toilet facilities and stuff. And I hope that was a sort of reassurance of what, a significant number, I guess, of the British public are pretty sensible and rational. And I think, masks are less part of society here than I suppose they are in China. And some people will obviously be up in arms about that and upset about it, but I kind of figure that they're the people who are less likely to go out for dinner anyway. And actually, we should just focus on creating an amazing experience for the people who are perhaps a little bit more relaxed.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's that real last point I think is really important, that the sector is, and these individual operators, the big operators, offer great experiences. And I think to focus back, as ever on those, as you say, that's what people are passionate about within the sector. That's what consumers ultimately want. And yeah, it would be diluted, I think, with face masks. That's my own personal opinion. It's what's coming through in the data as well. So I think as consumers, we do just want to return to some form of normality. I mean, I think looking at some of the plans, I thought Oakman Inns did a really good job in the press a couple of weeks ago showing how their venues would look, and they didn't look particularly sanitised. So I think that's the trick. Obviously, outdoor space, that's going to be easier. But yeah, you need to be able to sort of subtly change things, reassure customers, but not dilute ultimately the fantastic experiences they get, which is easy to say, but I think ultimately, as you say, hospitality is a people business, and offering that kind of warm smile and warm embrace, even if it's 2 meters away or 1 meter away, I think is going to be fundamental to the long-term success. And in that respect, I'm quite bullish about the sector because I know that it's adaptable, and the consumer research we're seeing is that consumers will return. So I think it's important to remember that you'll need to plan, and operators I know are planning their P&Ls, in great detail with scenario A, B, and C. You have to expect that revenues are going to be lower. You can do what you can to mitigate that, but you'll always have to budget for that, and staff accordingly. But ultimately, I think the sector will return. I just hope that we have as many businesses still trading when we get through that period.
Yeah, I think it's just a period of hang on tight and survive as long as you possibly can. I'm in a seasonal part of the country. We very much rely on the summers, but so the winter for us is, reduced opening hours. It's disappointing from a team perspective because, if we drop from maybe, 8 in the morning till 11 at night, 7 days a week, and we almost need 3 teams to cope with those kind of hours. But if we drop down to maybe, midday till 10, 5 days a week, potentially we only need 1 team. So, I see us potentially losing 2/3 of our team. And it's purely because normally we would make enough money in the summer to sort of sustain that team through the winter, and we're not going to have that option, which is desperately disappointing because there's so much talent and so much quality and so many people we've worked with for a number of years. And I would love to see the furlough scheme extended, particularly to our sector and maybe airlines and perhaps retail, although retail has a bit of a boom around Christmas that I don't think we'll be having in the hospitality sector in the normal way. But I guess it's batten down the hatches, get through it, and there's light at the end of the tunnel. If 30% of the industry has disappeared, then when we do go back to normal, I guess if you can get through it, there is a period of opportunity for a while. Yeah,
no, there will be, and I think that's the hope that people have got to hang on to. I think it's more than a hope. I think that's the reality of it. But it's obviously back to that question over who's going to survive. It's who's got the cash flow and the balance sheet, I suppose, to get through that period. Whether you're an individual operator, and many of those have obviously staked their houses, and I can only imagine the sort of pressures that they must be going through. But obviously, hopefully, as many as possible can come through. It's desperately tough times, but we've got to almost focus. I think the sector itself is pretty positive in the main, and I think ultimately it will return. And people do want that social experience, as we talked about. They do want to go out with their friends, and that's not going to change. The pandemic hasn't changed that. They're just concerned about their health, and that's understandable.
Definitely. Hospitality at the end of the day is thousands of years old. It's like I said, it's a human reflex. You open your door, you welcome somebody in, you give them something to eat and drink, and it will survive. It will continue. We are a very creative and adaptable sector that's been here for multi-generations and will continue to do so. It's just going to be tough for a while. You obviously will be continuing to monitor the data and do the analysis and provide some commentary. Where's the best place for people to go, Karl, to keep abreast of that?
So I guess ultimately our website. We also have an e-zine, so anyone can sign up to that. So weekly we provide insights that people can read and absorb for free. But yeah, ultimately our website, which is cga.co.uk. Obviously, feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll do what I can to answer any questions. And through this period, our plans are to continue to conduct consumer research because we know that sentiment is going to change. And we're continuing not just to speak to operators, but to conduct our business leader research. That provides often good ammunition for lobbying government on some of the real challenges that are facing the sector. So we're going to continue to do that. We're also, in combination with Wireless Social, going to look at footfall. So whereabouts are people milling about, going back to work, spending their time, and that will, I think, help inform where to open, but also hopefully track the recovery. And from a sales perspective, we're going to do that through Coffer Peach and our EPOS bill. So, for us, we're going to be focused even more on making our data available during this period, so that our clients can navigate through it, because it's such a fundamental shift that we can make certain predictions, but I think being agile, sort of understanding what your competitors are doing, understanding how the landscape's changing, is going to be fundamental at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think it's key. Good. All right, well, I will put a link to the website and contact details, and presumably people can sign up for that e-Sign directly on the website, can they?
They can indeed, yeah. So it's grown exponentially actually through this period. It's, I would say this, but I think it's really useful and it's great. Perfect. So by all means, hopefully we'll see people sign up to that.
Fantastic. All right. Well, look, thanks, Karl, for sparing the time. I can see this having to be a sort of, a reasonably regular thing to get the latest data and latest analysis, probably a little bit shorter next time. But thanks so much for going through it and sparing the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry if I waffle too much, but that's fine. It was really useful and really interesting, Mark. Thanks for showing your time.
Yeah, no criticism on you at the time. It's just I think we need to cover the sort of the pre, the in, and the post. Whereas next time we can probably just do from this point onwards. And,
the recovery. It'll be nice to sort of track the recovery and back to normal.
Definitely. All right. Thanks so much. Good luck. Cheers, Karl.
Thanks, Mark. Cheers.
So there you have it. Karl is full of stats, data and insight, and I've personally signed up to hear more from CGA moving forwards, and I've popped a link in the show notes via humansofhospitality.co.uk so you can easily do so too. Just head to the website and pop Karl with a K in the search bar. And whilst you're there, please also sign up to the weekly newsletter from me, where I will send you an update of new releases. And if you can support the podcast financially, hit the Patreon button, where all the revenue generated goes back into getting incredible guests and speaking to them on incredible kit, so I can make this show even better. Thank you for your support, and I will be back on Tuesday with a brand new episode.